300-pound dudes tackling you on a frozen field, the last thing you want to do is stay out there. Believe me, the Rams players were thinking about the jacuzzi at their team hotel, that they find it laughable, but more laughable if they totally disregard the trade whatsoever. This guy has transformed the balance of power in the Eastern Conference. And you could argue the entire defense is going to be absolutely ferocious next year. But if your number one priority is to win a Super Bowl, then J.J. Watt is making a grave mistake. To ride this Chad Henne experiment for an entire game, I might need a whole bottle of Hennessy just to get through that. Guy who's won 8 division titles, who's made 5 AFC championship appearances, who's reached the Super Bowl 3 times and has won 2 Super Bowls for this organization. Aaron Rodgers has only won 1 Super Bowl with Green Bay. Drew Brees has only won 1 Super Bowl with New Orleans. There's only 13 quarterbacks in NFL history that have won multiple Super Bowls, and Big Ben is one of those individuals. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe right here on J&J Media Network, Facebook Live, Twitter, and on YouTube. I'm Jonah Malkin, happy to be with you on a Wednesday morning. Morning Joe with you every single Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Glad you could join me. A lot to discuss today. Some interesting news in the NFL with the Carolina Panthers. Some huge ramifications, some ripple effects that could come about from their latest rumor. Interesting that in soccer, the European Super League, some weird fiasco is going on with them. I got my NBC Sports insider, Ben Cross, joining me later on in the show to talk the NFL draft and much more. And sticking with the NBA, because he will be talking about that as well. We have to start with the latest big news out of Brooklyn, New York. The Nets just cannot find some health. For whatever reason, they keep getting struck by the injury bug. James Harden out indefinitely after suffering a rehab setback on the court during on-court activities a couple days ago. So now James Harden is out indefinitely. Obviously, we just saw Kevin Durant leave the game against Miami with a high thigh contusion. This is a problem. This is a problem. And Steve Nash has come out and publicly said that they are going back to square one. And this is a problem because we always knew with the Brooklyn Nets, was chemistry going to be an issue? Now, I would be the first to admit that I always dismissed the idea that their chemistry wouldn't be the biggest impediment to this team. The biggest impediment would be just rather maybe their talent doesn't stack up. But seeing the slew of injuries, the spate of consecutive injuries being sustained to this team, it calls that into question again. Can this team truly find that cohesion that they need going into the postseason? Now, I believe that they can. I've always posited that I think this team, regardless of the circumstances, this talent, they have such an abundance of talent that it just exceeds any potential flaws. However, I will acknowledge this, that this is an issue, and sometimes the past has a weird way of rearing its ugly head forward to the present. Because let's look at who this team reminds me of. It reminds me exactly and eerily familiar to the Los Angeles Clippers last year. Let's think about it. What was the narrative surrounding the Clippers last year? Oh, this team is unbeatable when they're healthy. 11-1 last year were the LA Clippers before the bubble, when Paul George, when Kawhi, when Patrick Beverly, Morris, Lou Williams, when all of those guys played together. When they were healthy, that was the mantra. No, this team can beat anyone. They're unbeatable, unbreakable. Anytime they're in some stressful situation, a close ball game, a tight ball game. We'll figure it out in the postseason. This is the same issue that I think is starting to plague the Brooklyn Nets right now. You look at the Brooklyn Nets, they're 6-1 this year in just 7 games when it's Kyrie, KD, and Harden. When all 3 of those guys are on the floor, they're 6-1. The only game that they lost was a trivial game to the Cavaliers early in the season. And apparently, according to ESPN stats, there's never been a champion in which the top 3 scorers on the team, the top 3 players in points per game, if they've each missed double-digit games this year. Kyrie, KD, and Harden have all each missed 10 games this year. So this feels a lot like a team that we've seen before in the Clippers. And again, why did the Clippers crumble last year? It wasn't simply just the fact that their best players, Paul George and Kawhi, crumbled in the postseason, and especially in Game 7 against the Denver Nuggets. That obviously was the main catalyst behind their fall. But it was their lack of leadership. Who was the leader of the Clippers? Kawhi Leonard is not vocal. He's more of a passive leader. He's great when you insert him into a well-oiled machine, but if he has to start the ignition, if he has to be the guy that galvanizes everyone, at least as of last year, he wasn't able to do that. Paul George didn't have the cachet and the respect in the locker room to be able to rally those types of guys. Was it Doc Rivers? Well, Doc Rivers has his history and a litany of examples in which he has come up short in the postseason when he's had a lead and when he's been a favored team. Who was their main leader? That was the biggest impediment to their success last year. Now, it appears that Rondo is going to be able to fill that void, that he's the one that will be able to galvanize this team. In fact, the Clippers have only lost 1 game since Rondo has joined their squad, and that was when they played the Philadelphia 76ers on the road, and they lost by 3 without Kawhi. And now let's shift to the Brooklyn Nets. Who is their leader? Where's the leadership going to come from? KD is obviously their best player, but he's more of a taciturn and a passive leader himself. James Harden, as great as he's been in the regular season, we've seen the shortcomings with the Houston Rockets in the postseason and how he's still an all-star, but he's not an MVP caliber player in the postseason. Not to mention he joined the team late. So are you saying that James Harden joining the Brooklyn Nets midway through the season and they're going to just bequeath and confer that title of most valuable player onto him? And then you look at Kyrie Irving. He is no doubt clutch in the postseason. He is one of the clutchest postseason performers that we've seen. He hit one of the best shots, one of the clutchest shots in NBA history to win Game 7 of the NBA Finals back in the 2015-2016 season for the Cleveland Cavaliers. We've seen how great he is. But with his mercurial personality, is he really the wild card? Is he the guy that's going to lead this team? He wasn't able to do it in Boston. Not all his fault, but that's the reality. Is it Steve Nash? Steve Nash is a first-year head coach. Kyrie and KD have already come out and said that they don't even need a coach. So the biggest flaw right now is who is the leader of the Brooklyn Nets. So I hear all this talk about, well, cohesion and chemistry is going to be their biggest impediment and is going to hamper their chances of winning. And while I don't deny that, I was always willing to look past that. The reason why this team may or may not succeed and reach the NBA Finals, which I still think they will, is because at this moment in time, they haven't played long enough together to determine who the leader is. And that's a big difference. When KD was with the Warriors, yes, he was the best player, but it was clearly Steph's team. That was established right from the beginning. So the reason I worry about the Brooklyn Nets, again, is not necessarily because of the chemistry. I think we've seen, even in a small sample size, that this team can mesh really well. We've seen that. But the question is, who is the unanimous leader of the squad? And we don't know. We don't know who the leader is. So, again, I even had the Brooklyn Nets reaching the NBA Finals before they made the trade for James Harden, before LaMarcus Aldridge signed and then retired, before Blake Griffin joined the team after being bought out by the Pistons. I had the Brooklyn Nets going to the NBA Finals with just KD and Kyrie. And that prognostication seemed to be corroborated when James Harden joined the team, because they looked unbeatable. But again, with this spate of injuries, what I'm more worried about is who will rise through the ashes and say, you guys are going to follow me. And that lack of a true number one leader is what ultimately might derail this team. And again, with another injury like this sustained to James Harden, that's what I am most concerned about. Now, speaking of some of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, with the Philadelphia 76ers and Joel Embiid, made me start to think about who are some of the MVPs and who are my front runners for NBA MVP right now. So I wanted to break down my top 5 because I think that this is so interesting. Who is the true most valuable player, right? And unfortunately, I think that this year may be one of those few years in which an MVP is picked more out of default versus, are they truly the best player in the league and the most valuable player in the NBA? So this is my list for top 5 NBA MVPs currently. Again, this factors in a lot of players that have missed time, that are currently missing right now based on who's playing. Here are my top 5 MVPs. I have to start, unfortunately, I have to concede this. Paul George at number 5, the LA Clippers. And I'm a Lakers fan, but I will concede, in the beginning of the season, Paul George carried that team, and recently he has been on an absolute just demolition tour right now. And this guy has been absolutely fantastic. He just dropped 33 points in a win over the Trailblazers last night, iced the game with 2 free throws. He has scored 30-plus points in 5 of his last 6 games, in which they've gone 5-1 without Kawhi. It's been all Paul George. And here's the interesting thing. The Clippers actually have a better record when it's just Paul George playing than when Kawhi's playing. They're 33-12 when Paul George plays, and they're 32-14 when Kawhi Leonard plays. Again, I will be the first to admit Kawhi is the best player on the team, but right now Paul George has seemingly appeared to play more frequently than Kawhi, seems to be present. And this guy, for the season, 24 points, 5.5 assists, 6 rebounds per game. For the season, he's shooting 44% from 3. But in April, 29 points now, 48% from the 3-point line on 7.5 attempts. So this guy's production has continued to increase. The Clippers have been on a fire, on a roll recently. They've won 15 of their last 19 games. They've won 12 of their last 14. So, and the big reason why is Paul George. He's been the catalyst behind this team. At number 4, I have to go with Chris Paul, the Phoenix Suns. I know his stats aren't eye-popping, just 16 points, 4.5 rebounds, nearly 9 assists, but this guy is the ultimate winner. And when you talk about who is truly valuable to your team, and one of the most valuable players in the league, there's no one that epitomizes that more than Chris Paul. And I know that this isn't a celebratory tour, and it's not an achievement award. It's not a lifetime achievement award, but let's look at Chris Paul's impact with the New Orleans Hornets at the time. They were an irrelevant franchise, and he's attained the most success with that team in recent memory. more success than Anthony Davis, more success currently than Zion Williamson, although Zion Williamson will finish, I believe, as a better player. And then he gets traded to the Clippers, rescues that franchise that had sunk to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and the depths of the NBA into relevancy. They reached the postseason for the first time in years. Then he gets traded to the Houston Rockets, nearly leads them to the precipice, to an NBA Finals, and perhaps if he didn't strain his and pull his hamstring, they would have gone to the NBA Finals. They were up 3-2 over the Golden State Warriors that season with home court advantage. He missed the final 2 games. Then, where does he get traded to? Oklahoma City Thunder. The Thunder were planning on tanking this year, or last year rather. And he leads them to the 5th seed in the Western Conference and takes the Houston Rockets, the 4th seed, down to the wire in Game 7 with under a minute to go. I mean, this guy has been a one-man rebuilding project everywhere he goes. And now he's leading this Phoenix Suns team who, yes, their best player is Devin Booker. But the Phoenix Suns, this is a team that barely made it to the bubble last year. Then once they reached the bubble, they went 8-0 and certainly seemed like they were on the rise and were going to ascend and improve this year. But you can make an argument that Chris Paul is the main catalyst behind expediting that process. The Phoenix Suns haven't made the postseason in over a decade. And now in his first year, he's about to lead them not only to the postseason, but potentially to the number 1 overall seed. The Phoenix Suns have the number 2 seed in the NBA, let alone the Western Conference. They're only 1.5 games back of the Utah Jazz, and he's the main reason why. So he's my number 4 MVP right now. At number 3, I can't deny it anymore, Steph Curry. And you could argue some people have Steph Curry up at number 1. I was reticent to go up there. I can't put him all the way up at number 1 right now. I have to put him at number 3, though. He's been on this torrid pace. This guy now leads the league in points. I don't really care what their record is, although that is the main reason why I don't have them ranked higher. The Warriors, yes, they're the 9th seed in the Western Conference, but when you look at who is playing the best basketball right now, Steph Curry is that guy. 31 points per game so far for the entire season, 5.5 assists, 6 rebounds. Or rather, that's reversed. 5.5 rebounds, 6 assists. For the season, the guy is shooting 43% from the three-point line on 12 attempts per game. And get this, in the month of April, he's averaging 41 points per game, about 6 assists and 4.5 rebounds on 45% shooting from the three-point line on 14 attempts per game. He's been on this blistering streak. Obviously, he's the greatest shooter ever, the greatest shooter of all time. And he's doing this with no Clay, when he's being double and triple teamed on every single possession, when the game plan going in is designed to try and prevent him from scoring. He's getting trapped. He's getting shadowed the entire game. He's pulling up before double teams reach him. And the endurance level to be able to just run around, run off picks, and create for yourself when you are the only offensive piece, when you're the only go-to guy, is nothing short of spectacular. And he's been sensational. And over his last 10 games, which is all of April, these have been his point totals: 36, 37, 41, 32, 38, 53, 42, 33, 47, and 49 points over his last 10 games. I know we live in this world of recency bias, and you don't want to be prisoner of the moment too often. And it's true that a lot of players that are injured, they are contributing to this out of sight, out of mind kind of approach. But I would love to put Steph Curry higher on this list, but I can't, just because The Warriors are the 9th seed, and there are two other guys that are a little bit more deserving. And this is the most difficult part of this list right here, is number 2 and number 1. I know I'm going to get pushback for this. I have Nikola Jokic at number 2, and I have Joel Embiid at number 1, which I'll go over. But Nikola Jokic, statistically, there isn't anything I can say against the guy. He's been absolutely fantastic this entire season, nearly averaging a triple-double for this entire year. 26 points, 11 rebounds, 9 assists. He's efficient, 57% from the floor, 42% from three. He can also hit his free throws at an 85% clip. The guy has had 16 triple-doubles this year and 10 other games in which he's come up 1 rebound or assist short of reaching a triple-double. He has been absolutely fantastic all season. And again, just dropped 47 points, 15 rebounds, 8 assists in a double overtime win against the Memphis Grizzlies a couple nights ago. Statistically, there's nothing this guy doesn't do. Best PR in the league, number 1 in win shares, number 1 in offensive win shares, top 10 in defensive win shares, number 1 in plus minus. There's not much more I can say other than, and number 1 in field goals made as well. The Nuggets have the 4th best record in the West. They've won 3 straight games since Jamal Murray has torn his ACL. The only reason I can't put him at number 1, and I know he hasn't missed a single game, the only reason is just because when I watch my number 1 leader for MVP, Joel Embiid, who looks like the more dominant player when they're playing at their best? I think too often we simply evaluate players based on what their stats are. We saw Russell Westbrook, who's one of my favorite players. His jersey's behind me. In 2017, won the MVP with the Oklahoma City Thunder because he was the first player since Oscar Robertson to average a triple-double. But what do we truly value? And Joel Embiid is just physically different. He's dominant. He plays with a brute physicality and force that is unparalleled right now. He can hit the 3 ball at a 38% clip, averaging 30 points and 11 rebounds to go with 3 assists. He is shooting 12 free throw attempts per game, so he gets to the line. He's difficult to officiate. And since he's returned from injury, the 76ers are 6-2 with him since he's returned from injury. And over his past 3 games, these have been his stats: 39 points, 13 rebounds, 36 points, 14 rebounds, 28 points, 13 rebounds, 8 assists. This guy's been fantastic. They're 30-9 with him, 9-9 without him. So they're only a 500 team without him. With him, they're an elite contender. And again, I do think we're splitting hairs here with him and Nikola Jokic. If Nikola Jokic was to win, I would be extremely happy and congratulatory to him. He would deserve it. But at this moment in time, if you're asking me, who do I truly believe is the best player in the NBA this year, I have to say Joel Embiid. He's just physically dominant in a way that's just different. Man, he's just a man amongst boys, and he's an elite defender. So I just think, I understand he's missed a lot of time. I'm not going to hold that against him. At this point, he's come back with a fury. So I like the way that he's been playing right now. I have him as my number 1 NBA MVP leader. Transitioning to the NFL, this was huge. Now, I know people aren't going to think much about this, but the Carolina Panthers are reportedly in talks to trade back in the draft to trade off their number 8 overall pick. So this is really interesting. I've always been really infatuated with chess. It's one of my favorite games to play. I've always fallen in love with chess because it's the ultimate mind game. It's the ultimate game of strategy. You can plan ahead. You can plan 4 moves ahead of your opponent. Every single move is calculated. It's deliberate. There is a true intention behind the move. It's the same reason why, in a lot of ways, Magic hasn't kind of grown to be an archaic pastime, because there's something about the sleight of hand that still captures people's imagination in a way that they're mesmerized, because they're trying to identify, how is this magician executing this trick? What am I not seeing? And it gives off the impression like the magician is a couple steps ahead of the audience. And the Carolina Panthers are trying to play chess with everyone right now. They're trying to play chess with everyone right now. They're trying to use sleight of hand, because this is one of those rare moments where me, as the audience member, I know exactly what they're doing. My prognostication is going to be spot on with the Carolina Panthers. I know what everyone's going to say. What most people are going to say is a basic comment, some vapid remark, some obvious statement. Oh, well, clearly the Carolina Panthers are saying that they just don't really value a quarterback at the number 8 overall position. They're not really trying to take a quarterback, and they're just trying to stockpile draft picks. Maybe they're trying to benefit Sam Darnold, so they're trying to surround him with some more talent. And that is absolutely false. That is an erroneous observation by all these other people. I haven't spoken to anyone, but I know that's what they're going to come out and say. Here's the thing. What the Carolina Panthers, I know what they're intimating here. What the Carolina Panthers are implicitly saying, it's not that, oh, well, we don't really want to take a quarterback at number 8. In fact, it's a reality check, and it's them conceding and acknowledging the fact that we don't think that one of the quarterbacks that we'd be interested in, a la Justin Fields and Trey Lance, will be available for us to take at number 8. There's a big difference. The impetus behind that decision is very different. That's like you're interested in asking someone out on a date, and they've only got a short window of time available to ask them out. But you know that the timing perfectly precedes a time that you're going to spend a boatload of time with your family. You're going to spend the weekend with your family. And so because of that timing, you're now starting to entertain the possibility of avoiding asking that person out because of the timing. There's a difference between avoiding asking someone out because of potential fear of rejection and avoiding asking someone out because you know that you're going to be bombarded with questions by your family members right when you return from the date. People are going to ask you, how did it go? What'd you guys do? You're going to have to be dodging a salvo of artillery fires right in your direction. There's a big difference. And the Carolina Panthers, what they're not telling people now is not that we're not interested in a quarterback. We want to ask this quarterback out on a date. The timing isn't good. They are resigning to the fact that one of the quarterbacks that they would have been interested in are likely not going to fall at number 8. And that is a big, big distinction and a big, big difference. Raymond Vivo, should the Giants trade up with Carolina so they can have a better shot at Chase or Pitts with the past relationship Dave Gettleman has with the team? Appreciate you tuning in, Vivo. It's a good question. The interesting thing is this is actually the first time in Dave Gettleman's career that he has been entertaining the possibility of trading back in the draft, so not trading forward. I think that if you're the New York Giants, I don't think you need to trade. You need to trade forward. You signed Kenny Golladay, so your offense is set. Saquon Barkley's coming back. Evan Ingram, Sterling Shepard. I think that their defense, I think Joe Judge has this team bought in. The question is, they've been able to isolate all the variables up to this point, and the only variable left to determine is Daniel Jones. Is Daniel Jones the guy? And I think right now they've got the support system. They just traded and signed an offensive lineman over the offseason. So I think that all their other positions are set. They don't need to trade up to try and draft Kyle Pitts. In fact, I think Evan Ingram is one of the most underrated tight ends in the NFL. I think he's really good. maybe he's not going to be quite as good as the ceiling, the potential of Kyle Pitts, but I like him a lot nonetheless. Thank you so much for joining me. Morning Joe right here, J&J Media Network, Facebook Live, Twitter, and on YouTube, Mondays and Wednesday mornings, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Coming up in a couple minutes, NBC Sports insider Ben Cross will be joining me to discuss a lot of news in the NFL with the upcoming draft. So you're going to want to stick around for that. But first, I can't believe I'm even having to discuss this at all. And I don't want to take too much time to talk about this at all. But I just have to address the elephant in the room. Mark Davis, the owner of the Las Vegas Raiders, had a huge social media Twitter blunder yesterday. So we all know the verdict of the former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, was found guilty by the jury of all three charges. We know that. More work needs to be done. But a lot of teams were sending out not celebratory messages, but more messages of approval and accountability. And Mark Davis, the owner of the Las Vegas Raiders, tweeted out, "I can breathe." Now, the backstory behind it is that George Floyd's brother, Philanese, had uttered some remarks after the verdict was revealed. And he had said that today we are able to breathe again. So apparently this tweet from the Raiders was supposed to be inspired by that. Mark Davis. And he just came out and acknowledged that he was the one that suggested that the Raiders social media team tweet this out. He was the one. If this was any other employee, and this wasn't the owner of the team, they would get canned and fired immediately. Right on the spot. And this is such an idiotic, tone deaf, and poorly worded tweet. What, Mark Davis, what are you thinking? Obviously, it was condemned all across Twitter with replies. But sometimes I wonder, I understand what the intention is meant to be, but if this is trying to be clever or witty in some way, you have badly missed the mark. This is not one of those. This is not one of those moments to try and insert a position that isn't on the right side or the wrong side. You're trying to be clever. What are you thinking? Don't do this. Because this is just dumb. This is absolutely dumb. This is all that I want to say on it. Again, not only was it poorly crafted, he also pinned the tweet to the top of their page, which I just can't believe that. I can't believe the social media team. I mean, I guess, listen, if your owner says you have to do something, you do it. But this was one of the most befuddling moves from an owner. Normally, owners try and stay out of this. And I'm not saying you need to stay away from this topic, but if you want to say something, can you vet it a little bit? Can you have your PR team take a look and say, yeah, this is good to go, or no, you should have this sent to the editor? I just don't get it. Finally, one other note before I bring on NBC Sports insider Ben Cross. This is really interesting. I normally don't talk about soccer too much. But I have always been a soccer fan, and so I do follow soccer from a distance. And there's been this new revelation about a new league forming, the European Super League, essentially trying to branch away from the Premier League, the top teams from the Premier League in England, from the top teams in La Liga in Spain, and from Serie A, the Italian soccer league. The best teams from all of those leagues were attempting to branch off and play basically their own version of UEFA Champions League, but for the entire year. And the idea behind it was that it would raise more revenue and it would save football. And so the 12 teams that were involved that initially had agreed to this proposed Super League were Manchester City, Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, and Tottenham Hotspur, the teams from the English Premier League. In La Liga, Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Atletico Madrid from La Liga. And then in Serie A, the Italian league, AC Milan, Inter Milan, and Juventus. They thought it would provide financial support. So it just came out yesterday, literally over the last 24 hours, that all of the 6 English Premier League teams have now withdrew their proposed agreement to this league. We saw this morning AC Milan and Inter Milan in the Italian league back out as well. And so now the microscope shifts to the Spanish teams and Juventus. And to me, I understand the idea in theory that, hey, this will bring in more revenue. Because when the UEFA Champions League is bringing in $2.4 billion worth of TV revenue and they're having to play a bunch of nobodies throughout the process, well, let's just take the 12 biggest brands in soccer, group them together, clump them together in one league, and we can raise potentially $4 billion. Here's the problem. The problem is what you're saying is essentially you are devaluing all the other teams. And what you're going to essentially be doing is demoting all of those other teams from the English Premier League, from La Liga, from Serie A. And those leagues would eventually disintegrate. I mean, they would dissolve within a matter of months because the fans now aren't going to want to just tune in to watch those teams play. And so I understand, again, from a revenue standpoint, why they're interested in doing this. But I think that it's a very parochial view. It's selfish. It's greedy. You're coming across as more gluttonous. And I just don't see overall the benefits to doing this. The main captivating aspect of soccer and of sports is competition. And when you're removing the most important element to that, then what do you have left? The NBA can't just branch off and say, okay, let's take the Lakers, let's take the Celtics, the Heat, the Brooklyn Nets, the Golden State Warriors, and just create our own league. It fluctuates. Teams have up and down seasons. Even this year, Leicester City is 3rd in the English Premier Leagues, ahead of some of these teams. West Ham has a better record than some of these teams. Arsenal has a better record than some of these teams. But other years, they've been terrible. This year, Tottenham hasn't been good. So I just don't really I understand what they were trying to accomplish here, but this was just this flamed out faster than the Fire music festival. So if that says anything. Okay, and with that, I am pleased to be joined by a friend and a colleague of the show, NBC Sports Insider Ben Cross is joining me. Ben, good morning. I appreciate you joining me. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Jonah? Great to be here.
I'm doing well. First of all, did you even hear about the European Super League? I know you're not a big soccer fan, but I know that NBC does cover a lot of soccer, so I have to imagine that was discussed with you guys a little bit.
Well, obviously, we weren't necessarily aware how the broadcasting rights would shift if that league were to happen. We are the exclusive provider of the Premier League, at least in the U.S., and the U.S. market was one of the big drivers of the Super League. But we ultimately weren't told all that much. We were very aware of what was going on. And I think it was pretty clear almost immediately after the initial news that almost no club outside of the teams that decided to break off were going to be in support of this. The UEFA came out and said that any team that joins this is banned, any player is banned. Obviously, FIFA said the same. That would obviously affect the World Cup. It was shattering news as soon as it came out. And obviously, what we saw unfold yesterday, it probably won't happen. There's still a chance, but I think most likely, at least with a lot of the teams from the Big Six and the PL leaving, Juventus and a few other teams, it doesn't seem very likely. So it was shocking news. We definitely followed it over at NBC Sports and Peacock, but it wasn't something that ultimately we were too worried about, only because it was still in its novelty and in its early stages and never really formed to be what would have scared the entire world of soccer or football.
So let's shift to the NFL because I have to tell, I know that we're both excited about this NFL draft. I have to be honest with you, Ben, this is probably the first year since I can remember that there is so much intrigue within the top 10 picks just surrounding the quarterbacks. I mean, the way that people's opinions have fluctuated over the past couple of days, couple of weeks, it's almost amazing to me. And again, I don't want to ask you so much just yet about which teams should draft which quarterbacks, but what do you think about just all this movement around surrounding the opinions of these different quarterbacks? I mean, one week you have, oh, Mac Jones is going to be the third overall quarterback taken. Then Justin Fields' stock rises. Now we have Trey Lance entering the fold a little bit. What do you make of all this uncertainty and all of these fluctuations when we're trying to evaluate these quarterbacks?
Well, it's still early. We still have a week or so to go before the draft. And I think when it comes down to quarterbacks, when a lot of teams start to experiment with, oh, are we going to move up in the draft? There are rumors that certain teams become involved with the conversation. That's when these quarterback stocks go up and down. There's nothing these quarterbacks can do outside their pro days, which obviously are pretty isolated incidents and aren't high competition. They're just throwing to their own receivers in their own facilities. It's very controlled. It's not very experimental. It's really just them showcasing the fact that they can throw a football without pads on. There's not really too much to it. The only evaluation that can really change is what quarterback situations are out there for them. If there's a team like the 49ers that seems intent on drafting a quarterback, then which quarterback would they be most likely to take? Obviously, the rumors around them have been they're leaning toward Mac Jones. That rumor has come out or has been out in the stratosphere for a little while now, so I wouldn't be necessarily shocked if they've changed their tune. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the quarterback situations that these teams are involved in. And as these teams are rumored to move up and down in the draft order, I think that's when certain quarterbacks start to move up or down as far as their stock is concerned, because they're not, the quarterbacks themselves can't do anything right now outside of manage their own PR to the point where they could either move up or down in the draft. So I think it's the usual process. Obviously, there's a deeper draft from big names, big quarterbacks that might go. I don't necessarily see it as one of the deeper drafts as far as quarterback talent, only because I genuinely believe there's only 2, maybe 3 guys that I could see as consistent starters in the NFL. I think everyone else, at least right now, appears to be career backups that just have a big name, will go in the first round because of what the quarterback market is. But ultimately, I don't see all that many quarterbacks in this draft that are going to have lasting impact in the NFL.
So let's stick with one of the specific teams, because I think that the San Francisco 49ers are in such a precarious situation. It's interesting, Ben, because you would think that when you trade up for a number 3 pick and you give away so much to get that pick, you would think that the GM and the coach are aligned and they have the same process and the same mindset about a specific player. Clearly, that's not the case. Shanahan, at least has been reportedly interested in Mac Jones. John Lynch, the GM, interested in Justin Fields. Now, I've always said, and I know that the Jets are enamored with Zach Wilson, so I know they're going to take him. I've always said since the beginning of the season that I thought Justin Fields is the second best quarterback in college football. Obviously, he's not going to go to the Jets. Okay. But how surprised are you that those two aren't on the same page? And ultimately, who do you think the 49ers will go with? Do you think it'll be Justin Fields, or do you think Kyle Shanahan, if the reports are true and he likes Mac Jones, they might head with the Alabama quarterback?
I think it's interesting with that rumor that Shanahan has been interested in Mac Jones for a while now, and he's paid such close attention to him. I think they might be shifting direction at a certain point here, and I think it might go Lynch's way eventually toward Justin Fields. I think if you look at the pro days and what we've seen out of both quarterbacks since college football has ended, Justin Fields has seemed like the more impressive talent and has a higher ceiling. I don't think either of them are going to be consistent starters in the NFL, to be honest with you. I think they'll get their shot. But I think if you saw Mac Jones, even his pro day, he was missing wide open passes. He was not really showing all that much range as far as how far he can throw a football. This is without pads. And this is not something we should be shocked to see out of Alabama quarterback, considering how much receiver talent they have and have had. Obviously, we saw Tua. Tua, in his first few seasons in college football, seemed to be one of the most impressive talents we've ever seen at that level. And then he shows up with all the talent in the world in the Dolphins and really didn't have all that much of an impressive season. Granted, it was his rookie year and he was coming off of an injury outside of college, but it still was a situation for him to succeed in, and he didn't do all that well. I think Justin Fields has a higher ceiling, but ultimately I think they will go for Fields. Mac Jones just doesn't seem to be all that polished. He had a little bit of time in college football with some of the best receivers in college football who are about to be first-round picks. It just seems to me like Justin Fields is a higher upside, and especially if you're going to have someone compete with Jimmy Garoppolo, you want to train them for the future. And I just don't think Mac Jones has as much athleticism as Justin Fields, and I think that's going to hurt him in the long run. I think he has to be ready-made for the NFL now, and I don't believe that he is. And the more time that this rumor spends out in the NFL stratosphere, the conversations going on, I think the more people are going to realize, that might have been a strategy, that might have been a ploy just to put that out there, and then they go for Justin Fields when the draft actually happens.
So the pick that to me I'm most anticipating is the next one, is the Atlanta Falcons. The 49ers is intriguing because you know it's going to be a quarterback, but the Falcons are the first pick where you don't know what direction they're truly going to go in. Are they going to opt to try and draft, kind of pull a Green Bay and draft a backup quarterback who would eventually replace Matt Ryan, or will they try and expedite the rebuild, or will they try and actually fill a position that they need to be filled? Probably on the defensive end, they need a pass rusher. They need so much on the defensive side. If you were the GM, Terry Fontenot, would you kind of go in the direction of a Green Bay and draft a backup that you think would eventually replace Matt Ryan, or do you think they should draft a position they actually need filled on the defensive side of the ball?
It's difficult. Normally, I would say, without a question, go to the defensive side of the ball. There's not all that many great defenders out there this year. They could go cornerback. They could go Patrick Surtain out of Alabama. That would be a little bit of a reach. I think he might fall a little bit toward the latter end of the top 10. Quarterback's a big investment, though. So you've got two ends of this that really aren't all that positive. It's not a great draft for what the Falcons would need. I think they'll ultimately go backup quarterback, regardless of what Matt Ryan says. He says he wants to play in his 40s. He has shown some weakness at times. He's a little unstable. Sometimes he'll throw 6 touchdowns in a game, and sometimes he'll throw 6 interceptions in a game. You really don't know what you're going to get out of Matt Ryan at this point. He is a proven talent as far as he will not lose you games for the most part, and he could get you with a very successful team, as we've seen with him, to the Super Bowl. The question is whether they want to invest in something more long-term. But I think, at least with the Falcons' history, they're not going to bet on a guy unless they know he eventually will be an NFL talent and they can actually train that and make sure that he is. I don't know if they necessarily view any of the quarterbacks in this draft as NFL-ready talents or guys who will eventually be at that point. So I think there's a big internal discussion going on with the Falcons right now, and I think they're ultimately going to have to look inward and say, do we actually believe in any of these guys, or should we just throw a pick that might be a little bit of a reach on the defensive front? Because there's really not all that many pass rushers. There's almost no defensive linemen. There's some decent guys in the secondary you could grab in this draft. But as far as top 10 talents are concerned, you almost might be better off taking a chance on one of these quarterbacks, knowing you have Matt Ryan, because there's not all that much else that you could fill for a need right now, unless you trade out of that pick, grab some future picks, and then ultimately spend that on some defensive talent later in the draft.
So I want to stick to a team that's close to home for you, your Dallas Cowboys. I know as a fan, Ben, you're screaming defense. I mean, Patrick Surtain seems like a surefire bet at number 10. You would draft him. However, I want to throw out a situation. If Kyle Pitts somehow, and I don't think he's going to fall that far, if he falls to number 10, you are the Dallas Cowboys. What would you do?
Depends about what Dallas Cowboys you're talking about. If you're talking about Jerry Jones at the helm and him ultimately having the final executive decision, he would go for Pitts. But in recent years, I'd say last 6 or 7 years, the Cowboys have shifted more towards Stephen Jones' discretion in these type of decisions. We saw that with Johnny Manziel when he was on the board. The Cowboys passed on him. I think it was when Paxton Lynch was on the board. They passed on him and ultimately ended up with Dak Prescott. Stephen Jones seems like he has the market right now. I don't think that's going to be a conversation they're ultimately going to have because Pitts will go earlier, and I think his price will be too high for them to draft up to get him, which from a Cowboys fan perspective would be an absolute nightmare. I think Surtain is ready-made for the Cowboys. He's exactly what they need. He is a dominant player. I think he's absolutely going to be NFL ready, if not this year, the following season. Pitts, he's a generational tight end, but what are you looking for from the Cowboys offense at this point? You're really just looking for a healthy Dak and for Zeke not to get injured or just sell out. And beyond that, you really don't need any other weapons. The Cowboys have solid tight end room. They don't need another one. They certainly don't need to reach for one. And Kyle Pitts would exactly be that. So I hope the Stephen Jones side of the Cowboys will emerge in this draft and ultimately let Kyle Pitts go where he's going to go and then fill to the need, which is what the Cowboys have done in recent drafts. And they've had relatively successful drafts. Last year was a very successful draft. You can argue CeeDee Lamb was a bit of a reach, but at the same time, from where he fell, they ultimately got a good snag. You would hope that type of philosophy is out the window at this point. If Kyle Pitts falls to them, I think they'll ultimately take them. I don't agree with the decision, but I think that ultimately would be what would happen. But he's not going to fall to 10. That would be quite a shocker.
I kind of right now in a mock draft scenario have the Miami Dolphins perhaps at number 6, taking him more likely to truly evaluate Tua. But we'll see what that happens. I've even heard some reports about hypothetically, if a guy like Trey Lance dropped all the way to 10, would Jerry Jones consider it? I don't want to entertain it too much. I know you can get into a whole argument about it, so we'll leave it for the hypothetical. But let's transition to the NBA, Ben. This MVP race is really interesting to me because I almost feel like, not unfortunately, but I think that it's possible that one of the MVPs this year, it may come about more out of default versus whether or not they are truly the best player. I think that Joel Embiid, when he's been playing this year, I know he's missed games, and I love Nikola Jokic, but to me, when Joel Embiid has been playing, he's been the most dominant player in basketball. So I have a slight edge for him, but it's a very controversial pick. If you had to bet on the NBA MVP right now, who would you give it to?
It's a very tough bet to make because, as you mentioned, I think there could be two philosophies with the MVP this year. It could ultimately be who's the best player or who has just put up the best numbers this season. And as we've seen, a lot of the best players are sitting, a lot of the best players are injured. It's very tough to assess. I mean, Steph Curry, if he had been healthy this whole season and been playing at this pace, which obviously is a lot to ask, would be the clear front runner, but he has only shown in recent weeks coming back from that injury the stats that he would need to put that up. Obviously, you mentioned Jokic. I mean, there's a number of guys, Giannis is always in that conversation. And, you can talk about just a number of guys. Embiid is obviously, I think, the big name right now. If I had to bet on it, I would say Jokic, but Embiid, that's a lot is dependent on whether he can stay healthy. We know his injury past. If he can stay healthy and continue at this pace, I think it'll ultimately be Embiid. But if Steph Curry continues at this pace, it would be tough to see him losing out to anyone. I mean, guys making 10 threes a game, I think that's pretty historic at a certain point. So we'll certainly see. I think it's ultimately going to depend which player stays healthy the longest and plays the most this season, because ultimately I think they'll outlast everyone else in the conversation and just put up the best stats. And I think that's ultimately where the NBA will go, given all the injuries, Anthony Davis, LeBron, everyone being out. It's tough to see how the NBA would just say, oh, well, we know in other seasons they've played better, so we'll just give it to them based on a, small sample size. I think if you had to bet Jokic, only because of remaining healthy throughout the rest of the season. And they do have to stay on, I think, a title contending team, which Jokic, you could argue is, Embiid, you could argue is, Steph, probably not. So I think that's another a discussion that will have to enter the conversation.
Man, wouldn't that be fun if Steph won again? It would be. I think for him to seriously merit some strong consideration, I think the Warriors would have to avoid the play-in tournament. I think they'd have to be at least a top 6 seed at the minimum. Which,
It's
listen,
possible.
it's anything's possible. But man, it's he's been on this just torrid streak. It's been super fun to watch him. That would be amazing if he ended up winning the MVP, or at least if it really came down to like the last couple of games for the voters. Final question before I let you go. I don't think I actually asked you about this because we didn't really get a chance to recap the NCAA championship. Were you surprised at all by Baylor kind of just steamrolling Gonzaga? Was that at all a shock to you?
No, it wasn't a shock to me. It was a shock to me that Gonzaga was so heavily favored in the Vegas line. I think they ultimately at tip were favored by 4.5, but in the week prior, I think it was, or at least in the days prior, considering when the Final Four happened, I think they were favored by 6.5 right after they ultimately beat UCLA, Gonzaga, that is. But Baylor is just such a dominant team. I mean, from the tip of the tournament, they didn't leave any questions. I don't think they were ever in a close game. And when you saw how they handled Houston, who was a very solid team. I mean, I get that Houston wasn't one of the perennial powers throughout the season, but they dominated them. And I think we like to view college basketball now as this offensive juggernaut. If you put up 90 points a game like Gonzaga, you're going to be an elite team. Baylor was the best defensive team in the field, and they proved that each and every night. I mean, Mitchell, I couldn't believe how good of a defender he was. I mean, as Wisconsin fans, we saw Baylor against
do you take any solace in knowing that on that topic that Wisconsin did go out early in the second round, but the team that they lost to steamrolled everyone and won the whole thing?
You could argue Wisconsin put up as good of an effort against Baylor
They
as
did.
any team in the
I think
field.
they did.
So, right, for us, it's not necessarily a shock that Baylor just continued on that stretch. I mean, you saw Trice was on an absolute tear going into that game. He was absolutely shut down. The guards were amazing. And then if you look at the actual individual matchup between Gonzaga and Baylor, Drew Timme was really what was driving Gonzaga. I know everyone likes to say Jalen Suggs. He really only showed up in overtime and in the latter half of the game against UCLA. It was Timmy's team, and he was absolutely shut down against Baylor. The big men for Baylor came in and just absolutely demolished him, gave him no open opportunities. He was missing shots left and right. Baylor was just an all-around elite team. They could score the ball whenever they wanted to. They had great shooters. They didn't have great front court play as far as centers were concerned, but they didn't need it. Their shooters were so good. They were great in transition, and their defense was so suffocating. They really gave no team a chance. And as good as Gonzaga was, they were an offensive team. And if you slowed them down and forced them into some uncomfortable shots, I think you saw some weakness throughout the year. And this is always the thing with Gonzaga. They had a relatively easy road to the Final Four and ultimately the championship game. Obviously, UCLA pushed them to their very limits. They hadn't really had to play a competitive game since very early in the year, and they dominated all those games. They didn't know how to react to adversity. They kept it closer in the second half than I think I would have expected at halftime. But regardless, Baylor was the undisputed national champion, and I wasn't surprised at all.
Always good stuff from Ben Cross. You can follow him on social media. Check out Peacock and all the other content that NBC Sports is putting out. Ben, thanks for coming on the show, man. Always great catching up with you.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
All right, Ben Cross. Always love having Ben Cross on the show. Always fun for me. Final topic of the day, Malkin's moments. My favorite moments from the past week. We've got a couple. Chris Paul just passed Magic Johnson for 5th all-time on the NBA's all-time assists leaders. Wow, what an accomplishment again for a guy in Chris Paul. I have him as my 4th in the MVP rankings right now. The job that he's done with the Phoenix Suns has been nothing short of spectacular. And to pass a guy in Magic Johnson, who is recognized as the greatest point guard of all time. I know Steph Curry's entering that discussion and has already entered that discussion, but to pass a legend in Magic Johnson, who was such a visionary with the basketball, a guy in Chris Paul at 6 feet to do that is absolutely sensational. Zion Williamson, congratulations to him. He just unveiled his first signature shoe, and he's actually just became the first generation Z athlete to come out with their own signature shoe. So big shout out to him with Jordan Brand, to Zion Williamson. And then finally in the NHL, Patrick Marleau The San Jose Sharks forward just passed the legendary Goody Howe to become the NHL's all-time leader in games played. He just passed him when he played in his 1,768th game of his career, which passed Howe's mark of 1,767 games. He's 41 years old, entered the league in the 1997-1998 season. So that's all the time that I got for you today. Thank you so much for joining me every Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. You've been watching Morning Joe. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow on YouTube, follow me on Twitter. I love engagement. And as always, have a lovely rest of your morning.